Survival on the Ostfront, I had quickly learned, required the protection of a guardian angel, and I did not have long to wait for my next visitation. A Russian unit sheltering in a shallow ravine blocked our advance. The infantry of 2. Compagnie took up positions along the far side of a field, about 2 kilometers from our company command post and in contact with the enemy. I reeled out my telephone cables to them, across the dry, stubble-covered field. There was only the occasional whine of stray bullets as I ran out the final connection. I was making good progress, pleased that I had carried out my duty effectively. 20 meters ahead, a handful of infantry reinforcements were moving in the same direction. When we were halfway across the field, the sudden thud of an explosion sent me diving for cover. I looked up to see a column of fine dust hanging in the air like a transparent spectre. As the dust settled, one of the infantrymen called out for a medical orderly. Sani, Sani. My blood ran cold. An unlucky soldier had stepped on a mine. Looking around, I noticed a clump of grass, yellower than the rest, a few meters to my right. Amongst it lurked a hastily camouflaged anti-personnel mine. Without communication with our command post, our mortar and machine gun positions would be unable to support the infantry, who would then be vulnerable to counterattack. There was no turning back. I had already crossed the minefield twice without mishap. Entrusting my life to my guardian angel, I sprang to my feet and continued to reel out my telephone cable, dreading every step. As I passed the wounded soldier, one of his companions was already trying to staunch the flow of blood from the stumps of the shattered legs, while another grasped his hand to offer comfort. I tried not to imagine the pain the man would suffer when the shock of the moment had passed. When I reached the front-line foxholes, an officer beckoned. I slung the bakelite box containing the telephone onto the ground beside him and thrust the earthing spike into the powder-dry earth. The officer grabbed the telephone and tried to call the command post. "It's not earthed properly," he screamed. "I can't get through." I fumbled with the earthing spike. "Piss on it, man, piss on it. What do they teach recruits these days?" Having learned an important technique in practical telephony and not wishing to overburden my guardian angel, I skirted the minefield in a 5 kilometers detour to make my way back to the command post. "Piss on it, man, piss on it. What do they teach recruits these days?" Having learned an important technique in practical telephony, and not wishing to overburden my guardian angel, I skirted the minefield in a 5 kilometers detour to make my way back to the command post. Storming along the northern shores of Sea of Azov, we took Melitopol, despite stubborn Russian resistance, then fought back a Soviet breakthrough in the sector of the front line entrusted to our Romanian allies. Continuing eastwards, we took Berdyansk. Although only lightly defended, it was here, while attached to an infantry platoon, that I first experienced the nerve-wracking task of clearing out a Soviet-occupied trench system. On reaching the enemy trenches, we divided into 2 groups and stormed in opposite directions. The uncertainty in the defender's mind, who did not know whether friend or foe would appear around the sharp bends in the trenches, gave us a lethal advantage. Reveling in the ecstasy of victory, our hair bleached by the hot Ukrainian sun, we sang until our throats turned hoarse as we headed for Taganrog. A column of refugees brought our trucks to a standstill. They were fleeing, not from us, but from the Soviet army. They carried their belongings in a large sacks, twisted in the middle and slung over a shoulder so that one half was to the front and the other to the rear of the body, a technique that allowed both hands free to carry additional baggage. 3 officers from the lead truck, just 50 or so meters ahead, jumped to the ground with pistols drawn and scolded the refugees for slowing our progress. Reluctantly, the refugees, mostly women and children, formed a ragged line along the roadside ditch. As we drove past the upturned faces, a girl of around 18 lowered her sack to the ground and with a deft flick of her hand passed her shiny dark hair behind an ear. "Gute Reise," she called out, waving her hand. Perhaps that was all the German she knew. "Danke, danke," replied a comrade sitting at the side of the truck, a huge white smile lightening his suntanned face. "My God, she's beautiful," he said, craning his neck to hold her in view, for as long as possible as our truck trundled past the officers who stood at the edge of the road to oversee the column's progress. I had not expected to hear the girl's voice again, but her screams pierced easily through the grinding of the truck's engines. We stood up as a man to look back, to see what was happening. "What in God's name is he playing at?" a camarade exclaimed angrily. Towards the rear of our column, the girl struggled to free herself from under one of our men. The officers, alerted by the commotion and with pistols at the ready, ran up to the girl who, powerless under the weight of her assailant, screamed as he ripped at her clothes, oblivious to the approaching officers. The three officers yanked the Leibstandarte man, a veteran of the campaign in Greece, as I later learned from the girl, flinging him to the ground. Shots rang out from a pistol, and the man lay still. With open mouths, we stared at the officers as they hurried back to their vehicle at the head of the column. Left to rot at the side of the road, the dead man was no longer one of us. It was a lesson that required no words of explanation. A sizable town overlooking the Sea of Azov, Taganrog, with its steel pipe and aircraft construction facilities, was an important strategic target. Our attack column, severely depleted by losses sustained in the recent fighting, consisted of around 300 men and a handful of Sturmgeschütze, armoured assault guns that, like tanks, ran on tracks. With the river Mayus behind us, we followed a road that ran alongside the rail line leading south to Taganrog. Where there were dips in the landscape, earthen embankments carried the track high enough to obscure our view of the opposite side. With no interference from the Russians, it was full speed ahead, our Kompanietrupp travelling in one of the 3 trucks donated to the Leibstandarte by President von Hindenburg in 1932, somewhere near the middle of our column. We came to an abrupt halt. Rising to my feet to get a better view, I saw Hauptsturmführer Krotzer, binoculars in hand, climb to the lip of the railway embankment to our left. After scanning the landscape, he ordered the mortar crews to set up their weapons on the flat ground by the roadside. The machine gun crews took up position at the top of the embankment. Ammunition was distributed. In the distance, a haze of red dust hung above 300 or 400 Russian cavalry and accompanying wagons. In the tone of a man who had come into some great fortune, a machine gunner smiled. "It's a duck shoot if they don't get wind of us." The engines of our vehicles fell silent. Each passing minute brought the Russians closer, as if from the very earth of Mother Russia herself, a faint, unsuspecting melody, gentle and sweet, rose and fell like a feather on the cool breeze. Completely unaware of our presence, the Russian column was now directly opposite our position. Fire! Men and horses fell under a cascade of mortar rounds. Wagons disintegrated into matchwood. Panicking, the Russians, civilians amongst them, ran for the safety of the hinterland. The charging handles of our machine guns clicked into place, and the air rattled as a scything crossfire sliced through the scattering enemy. A commissar managed to inspire enough discipline to organize an improvised cavalry charge, but we fired from the shelter of the embankment, cutting down the futile attack without mercy. As the number of targets diminished, the hail of fire from our weapons waned. The order to call off the attack ran through our lines. The burr-burring of our machine guns stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The faint wail of wounded men and horses hung above the field of slaughter. A few stunned Russians staggered to their feet, holding their hands aloft. An officer yelled, "Now for Taganrog! The Wehrmacht are close behind. We'll leave it to them to deal with the wounded." 2 Russian tanks threatened to stall our progress into Taganrog, but we were in no mood to be delayed. 4 of our machine guns fired on them. The racket inside a tank under machine gun fire could easily panic an inexperienced crew, and there was always the chance that a lucky round would find the space between the turret and the body of the tank, jamming the teeth of the gear on which the turret rotates. As the tanks snorted and shunted, their guns swinging threateningly in our direction, an anti-tank gun from another battalion fired on them. The first tank exploded from within with a hollow booming sound, throwing the turret to the ground where it clattered to a halt after rolling a few turns. Before the commander of the second tank had time to react, the anti-tank gun fired again. The second tank recoiled slightly before coming to a standstill. Smoke billowed from the wounded vehicle. Despite the continuing hail of machine gun fire, the hatch opened and a crew member tried desperately to hoist himself free, but he reeled back, arms flung into the air, before slumping into the steel cooker that only moments earlier had been a vehicle of war. In the heart of the town, armed with my treasured Gewehr 98, I made a dash for the security of a shop entrance on the corner of a road leading to the harbour. Sidestepping the rubble to avoid tripping or twisting my ankle, I held my rifle at arm's length for balance. Before covering half the distance, there was a vivid purple flash just to my right. An invisible force grabbed my arm, throwing me off balance. For a moment I lay absolutely still, listening to the small stones thrown up by the explosion tap against my helmet. Expecting my arm to be badly injured, I repeated in my head the maxim drilled into me at Lichterfelde: pain is in the brain. In a fog of fine dust, I staggered to my feet and was surprised to find that apart from a few minor grazes to my hands, I was uninjured. I looked around for my prized rifle. At first, I didn't recognize the broken weapon lying amidst the rubble. Shrapnel that could easily have amputated my leg had sliced off the beautiful butt. Once more, my guardian angel had been by my side. As I caught my breath in the relative safety of the shop doorway, my attention was attracted to the harbour, where a Russian warship took hit after hit from one of our flak cannon. Clouds of black smoke rolled into the air above the vessel. Within seconds it sank, blocking the entrance to the harbour. I soon found a replacement rifle, but my work for the day was not yet finished. The Usher called my name, together with 5 others from my Kompanietrupp. He appointed a leader, a Rottenführer who had been with 4. Kompanier since the launch of Operation Barbarossa, a chap who seemed to make a point of keeping to a small circle of friends from which I was excluded. "These buildings," said the Usher, pointing to the top of a steep hill overlooking the harbour. "Take your men up there and hold the building next to the lighthouse. It's a radio station." We checked we had sufficient ammunition in the leather pouches carried on our belts, and without further delay started for the steps that snaked up the hill. Despite the cool October breeze, sweat carved out pink tracks on our dust-encrusted faces as we climbed the steps. On reaching the lip of the plateau, where the buildings perched, we threw ourselves to the ground to recover our breath and plan the next move. Loud popping sounds came from inside the building, each pop followed by the tinkling of broken glass. We looked quizzically at each other for a few moments before deciding the sounds posed no particular threat. Our Rottenführer turned to the biggest man in our squad, a 198 centimetres colossus. "Kick the door in. The rest of us will cover the windows and sides. We'll rush it as soon as you break through." The giant launched himself forward without the slightest hesitation, covering the ground quickly with his long strides. The door juddered under a hefty kick. Abruptly, the sound of breaking glass stopped. Russian voices screamed in alarm as our camarade continued to kick at the door, which soon burst free of its hinges. I was the first to enter, just in time to see the scurrying Russians leave from another door at the end of the long, narrow room. Instinctively, I made to rush after them. "Stop! You don't know what's behind that door!" roared the Rottenführer. I still had much to learn about how to survive. The other men in our squad edged up to the windows at the rear of the building and tentatively looked out to the scrubby surroundings. "No sign of them," reported a camarade. With his machine pistol ready to fire, the Rottenführer nodded towards the rear door. "Open it." I yanked the door open, allowing the Rottenführer to rush out. He looked down the hill on the other side of the building and lowered his weapon. "It's clear," he announced. "Let's see if there's anything left intact. I'll have to make a report for the Usher." Among the shards of glass on the wooden floor, a myriad of tiny shining globules glinted, quicksilver from the huge electronic valves the Russians had smashed on the floor. Before long, a messenger arrived from the command post with news that we had taken Taganrog. Our Rottenführer made a verbal report to the messenger and asked for further instructions, which duly arrived. "Remove all mercury from the building. Leave all doors and windows open. We don't want to lose men to mercury poisoning." We searched around, found a shovel and brush, and swept the heavy liquid metal towards the back door where it formed a sizable puddle. We spent most of the following day clearing the town of Russian soldiers hiding in the rubble. As we checked a cemetery, I came across the body of the Untersturmführer, who had threatened us with court-martial, as we sang with the bunch of friendly Ukrainians soon after our arrival on the Ostfront. slumped face down against a gravestone in the corner of the cemetery. He had been shot through the head. How this misfortune happened, I cannot say. These things happen in war, but I have always suspected that the fatal wound was not one inflicted by the enemy. With the dangerous task of clearing the town complete, and without loss or injury to our little compagnie troupe, we looked forward to settling down for the night with a roof over our heads. No sooner had we found a suitable place to bed down, when I received an order to report to the local headquarters of the Russian State Political Directorate, GPU. It was a beautiful evening, with the low sun bathing the streets in a golden light. Under the direction of an officer, I joined a queue of kameraden, most of whom I recognized as fellow newcomers. I happened to find myself behind Max, the chap that had accidentally shot himself in the dormitory in Lichterfelde. "Do you know what all this is about?" I asked. He pointed to a well that stood close by in the street. "They found the bodies of a reconnaissance troop from 3. Company in the well, no tags. We're here to identify them." I was puzzled. The dead men were from a different company, so I was unlikely to be able to assist in their identification. Inside the GPU offices, the bodies of 5 kameraden lay on stretchers, under sheets with only their faces exposed. Their expressions were not those of men killed in combat by some sudden catastrophic event, but one of utter despair. As I left the building, I shaded my eyes against the low sunlight to see an old hare cursing angrily as his audience of newcomers listened stern-faced and tight-lipped. "Handschuhe. The bastards, the fucking bastards," the old hare snarled. A few steps brought me to the edge of the group. "Saw it with my own eyes," he went on. "Handschuhe. What's that?" I interrupted. "Ah," said the old hare. "It's a little speciality the Russians amuse themselves with if they capture an SS man. They hold your hands in boiling water until they go white." He held his hands up as if about to pull off a pair of gloves. Then they slice around the wrist and pull the skin off. When they're bored with torturing you, they shoot you in the back of the head, if you're lucky, but they usually go for the bollocks first. Or they might hang you on a tree by your arms, then light a little fire under your feet until they turn to charcoal. Stalinsocken, they call that. An icy shudder ran through every sinew, every nerve in my body. I had seen men who had suffered horrific wounds, injuries inflicted in the storm of battle by bullets or shrapnel, by mines and by fire, but to deliberately torture a prisoner was an act beyond my comprehension. "Ah, my friend," continued the soldier, "haven't you been told yet? Don't let yourself be captured by the Russians. Don't you worry. The bastards will get what's coming to them." My stomach churned with hatred for the Russians. My call to the GPU offices had not been without purpose after all. Towards the end of October 1941, we withdrew to defensive positions to consolidate our lines. Reconnaissance units were deployed to keep an eye on the antics of the Russians who, we suspected, were about to throw themselves into a determined counterattack. 4. Companies set up their machine guns on the side of a hill and adjusted the ranging gear on their gun mounts to define the killing zone, but being dangerously far apart, they left large gaps left in our defences. My own little home for this period, which proved to be about 3 weeks, was a trench about 1/2 metre wide and 1.5 meters long. It rained heavily and frequently, so, to create a little bunker, I went into the nearby town to pick up an old door to cover the hard-won slit in the cold earth. To complete the construction, I piled waste soil on top of the door, leaving only a tiny opening beside which I placed my telephone and 4 stick grenades. I spent most of the time alone, sheltering from the rain. Life wasn't exactly comfortable inside my tiny burrow, but I managed. One afternoon, a prolonged Russian artillery barrage broke the peace in my little nest. It was a strange sensation, crouching alone in a cold hole in the ground so far from home, knowing that, if fate saw fit, a shell would rip my body to shreds in a searing flash of light. Worse still was the prospect of some horrific injury, or simply being wounded badly enough to prevent escape if we were overrun by the Russians, who, I now knew, had many ingenious ways to kill a member of the Waffen-SS. I waited, eyes stretched wide in fearful anticipation, until the artillery barrage came to a stuttering end. The approaching battle cry of Russian infantry broke the brief silence, and the air buzzed with bullets from rifles and machine guns. Mortar grenades exploded with dull thumps all around. My fingers tightened on my rifle as I prepared to step into the short section of open trench at the entrance of my bunker. Without warning, there was an almighty boom. I came to my senses in total darkness and absolute silence. The thought came to me that I might be dead, doomed to spend eternity in a world that contained nothing but my lonely soul. Frantically, I clawed at the earth at where I thought the entrance had been. A chink of light showed, and soon the hole was large enough to poke my head through. Gradually, the zipping sound made by bullets flying low over our trenches came back into focus. A voice called, "Irwin, Irwin, are you wounded?" Half dazed, I looked around to see the crew of a nearby machine gun crew wave their hands. "No," I replied. They laughed. I cleared the debris from the entrance of my bunker and found a crater where only seconds before my stick grenades had lain. A bullet or piece of flying shrapnel must have hit them, causing the detonation that would have killed me if I had stepped out only a second sooner. There was no sign of my telephone. Once more, my guardian angel had kept me from harm. "We thought you were a goner, Irwin," called a comrade from the machine gun crew. I waved to show him that I was still in the land of the living. Now the battle really started. As usual, the Russian infantry threw themselves into the killing fields of our machine guns, their wounded and dead piling on top of each other. It was a senseless way to attack, and the Russian soldiers paid a horrifying price for the suicidal tactics of their commanders. Still they pushed across the muddy field, tripping over their dead, standing on their wounded. The attack was petering out. Our guns fell silent. We were ordered to fix bayonets, an order usually only given for the clearing of towns where hand-to-hand combat was expected, but the Russians put their hands in the air and yelled, "The war is finished!" As the prisoners passed, I left the shelter of my foxhole to get a closer look at them. There was panic etched on their faces as they realized they had surrendered to a Waffen-SS unit. No doubt they had succumbed to their government's propaganda leaflets and feared they would be shot out of hand by their captors. Mostly the prisoners kept their eyes directed to the ground, but I caught the eye of one of them and made what I hoped was a friendly gesture, a light wave of my hand. The Russian, a tall, sturdy man with high cheekbones, nodded ruefully as he approached. His hands dug into his pockets, then he shook his massive head as he showed me his empty palms. I pointed to his cap. Without a word, he took it from his head and ripped off the badge with the Soviet star. He handed it to me with a wry smile that exposed the gaps where his front teeth should have been, then joined his comrades. As he shrank into the distance, he turned to look back. I gave a farewell wave of my hand, which he returned. I still have that badge. It shares the same cardboard box as my wound badge and Iron Cross. On reflection, it was careless of me to accept that gift. If captured with the Russian cap badge in my possession, it may well have provoked my captors to inflict worse than usual tortures. Still, in moments of reminiscence, when I take the badge from its box, my thoughts return to that day, and the hope rises in my heart that somehow the Russian managed to rejoin his family. Black mud slurped on every footstep. Ice-cold arrows of rain drummed on our steel helmets, throwing up halos of spray. We came to the edge of a field overlooking a dismal, dilapidated village with an indecipherable name, waiting for the return of a 6-man reconnaissance troop. A veil of drips cascaded from the rim of my helmet. Our platoon leader was becoming anxious and peered into the gloom with binoculars. Verdammt! He cursed. I can't see clearly in this rain-holed fire. His order was unnecessary. None of us would have opened fire without his command. 200 meters from our position, figures emerged from a stand of scrubby bushes. One of them waved both arms 3 times, paused, then waved another twice. "That's them," announced the platoon leader, lowering his binoculars. The spy troop reached our lines. As they passed, they cursed the rain. "Kameraden," said one of them, "we'll have to fight for our beds tonight." My Kompania-Trupp joined an infantry unit to bolster its strength for the attack. With house-to-house combat looming, we snapped our bayonets onto our rifles. As we entered the village, Russian machine gun fire claimed a few of our Kameraden. I took cover in a doorway. Bullets turned the stonework around the entrance to dust. A ricochet whirred like wings of a hummingbird before smacking against the wall close to my face. Our MG-34S returned fire. There was a muffled explosion. The machine gun noise from both sides came to an abrupt halt. I risked a quick look around the corner of my refuge and saw smoke coming from a window of a house 50 meters deeper into the village. One of our men had managed to get close enough to toss in a stick grenade. Street by street, we battled in the cold, lashing rain until we captured the village. Before we had time to set up an effective perimeter, the Russians mounted a vigorous counterattack, forcing us to retreat. We regrouped and pushed forward once more to retake the lost ground, with individual houses changing hands several times. By evening, we had driven the Russians out for the final time. Our companier had taken only light casualties, fewer than might have been expected in such a situation, with just 4 of us occupying the front room of a house on a street corner, the only one occupied by Germans within 100 meters. We were in a vulnerable position. Nevertheless, after an exhausting day, it was a relief to get out of the rain that still pattered against any window pane left intact. A chaise longue with tattered red upholstery, the only furniture in the room, stood against the wall opposite the only window. In a fleeting moment of pleasure, we sat on it to enjoy our damp bread and cold sausage, all 100 grams of it, before settling down for the night in uniforms that reeked of mould. The rain had at last relented when I took the over-the-watch from Boris, a Romanian of German descent whose fluency in Russian had earned him the task of unofficial compagnie interpreter. Beyond my vantage point at the window, floods of silvery light splashed across the wet street as the moon found gaps in the dashing clouds. Boris slumped into a heap in a corner of the room beside our 2 sleeping Kameraden, and immediately began to snore. I leaned my rifle against the wall and tried to ignore the rumbles of complaint from my disappointed stomach. After struggling to keep my weary eyes open for an hour, the faint rise and fall of voices on the chill night breeze startled me into full wakefulness. I peered around the edge of the window. Were the voices louder? Were they some sort of auditory hallucination brought on by fatigue and hunger? Were they Russian voices? I listened intently. My blood ran as cold as the rods of rain that had plagued the day. Hardly daring to breathe, I grabbed my rifle. "Irvin," said Boris in a whisper. "What is it?" "I thought I heard voices." Without taking my eyes from the glistening moonlit street, I replied, "Russians, 12 of them, coming this way." My finger hovered over the trigger of my rifle as the enemy soldiers stopped directly outside the window. Armed with submachine guns, they were certain to storm the house if they spotted me. With only rifles and grenades for protection, we would easily have been overrun. I held my breath and drew back into the deep shadows while keeping the enemy within sight. An argument in subdued voices broke out amongst the Russians, with one soldier vigorously stabbing his finger in the direction from which they had just come. They were lost. Suddenly, they fell silent. Someone was calling from farther up the street. Muted laughter broke out. A comrade slapped the back of the soldier who had led the way as they wandered out of view. I lowered my rifle and took a deep breath, the first for several minutes, though it seemed like an eternity. The creaking of a window from the back room of the house grabbed my attention. Regenbogen. It was the correct password, in Boris's unmistakable voice. In the excitement, I had not noticed him leave. He came into the front room with a smile on his face. "Irvin, did you hear their officer call them back?" "Ja, it was lucky for us," I replied. Boris chuckled. "That was no Russian, it was me. Now you owe me an hour's watch." Our 2 sleeping Kameraden wakened, unaware of the peril that had stalked the streets just a few meters from our refuge. Night frosts hardened the mud. With our vehicles now able to move freely over the undulating countryside, Rostov, gateway to the oil fields of the Caucasus, was within our grasp. At 0300 HRS on the 17th of November, a blanket of chill mist deadened every sound, deepened the darkness. At 0600 HRS, Hauptsturmführer von Westerhagen addressed the troops. "It will be no easy task, expect a hard battle. Refrain from eating in case of stomach wounds." It was a warning we had heard countless times before. Shortly after first light, the mist lifted like a curtain to reveal the theatre of combat. The infantry of 1 and 2, Kompanie, supported by the mortars and machine guns of 4. Kompanie and a squadron of Sturmgeschütze led the assault. Tanks with the white-painted letter G on their armour. They were from Heeresgruppe Guderian, took up position some distance behind 4, Kompanie. They fired off a few rounds but made no effort to advance. Our Sturmgeschütze showed no such hesitation and followed the forward infantry units into the thick of the fighting. We paused in a deep anti-tank ditch to wait for further orders. These ditches, with their steep sloping sides, posed a dangerous obstacle for tanks. With no space to turn, a reversing tank caught in one of these traps would have its gun point harmlessly to the ground. Naturally, every tank crew wished to avoid such a vulnerable predicament, and the Guderian tanks pulled back to safety. In the meantime, men from our Pioneer Corps found mines by the 100. They quickly cleared the area and built an earthen bridge over the ditch for our Sturmgeschütze to cross. With the roofs of Rostov in sight, we were surprised our tanks did not follow on immediately. Nevertheless, we continued with our plan to push forward for 10 kilometers before digging in to await our next orders, but the enemy, surprised by the vigor of our advance, retreated at speed. Our plan to dig in abandoned, we chased after them to deny them time to create new defensive positions. By the time we reached the outskirts of Rostov, we were isolated from our main army group with no radio or telephone contact. Sepp Dietrich, our divisional commander, sent 2 motorcyclists by separate routes to re-establish contact with our command post and relay the news that we intended to pursue the Russians as far as the River Don, where 2 bridges, a steel rail bridge and a timber bridge carrying the roadway, ran side by side. We soon secured the rail bridge, but lacking ammunition, were unable to prevent a large body of Russians making good their escape across the timber bridge in well-organized columns, a matter we would come to regret in the coming days. When the tanks of Heeresgruppe Guderian finally appeared in Rostov, I heard a Leibstandarte officer remonstrate with a Wehrmacht tank commander. "Where the hell did you get to?" "Oh, we don't follow infantry units until the crossings over anti-tank ditches are secure," he replied. Shortly after entering Rostov, I was in the company of a few Kameraden, among them an Unterscharführer by the name of Hahn. We were wandering near a street junction exchanging news of who had survived and who had fallen. As we passed close to a high timber fence skirting one side of the street, a gate, almost indistinguishable from the fence itself, snapped open from the other side. Unterscharführer Hahn called out, "Achtung!" I caught a glimpse of a Russian officer in a long brown leather coat. He let loose a few rounds from a revolver. Hahn groaned as he doubled up. Before I had time to react, the Russian slammed the gate shut. Clasping his stomach, Hahn grunted, "After the bastard." Heedless of what might be on the other side, we crashed through the gate to give chase, but the Russian managed to make good his escape without us being able to fire off a single shot. We returned to find Usha Hahn face down on the ground. I rushed over to kneel beside him, ready to apply a field dressing. When I turned him onto his back, it was clear that it was already too late to save him. Blood drenched the uniform around his abdomen. I stayed there for a moment, helplessly watching the last movements of his lips, thinking how suddenly the end might come for any one of us in that god-forsaken town. "Here, cover him with this," said a camarade, holding out his tent tarpaulin. "We can't just leave him here in the middle of the road," I protested. "We'll drag him over to the fence. Someone will find him and bury him later," was the reply. Later that day, an Untersturmführer caught up with me as I reeled out a telephone cable to a machine gun crew that had set up shop near the railway station. "Report to the field hospital and ask to see Hahn's body after you've laid the line to the machine guns. It's just a formality, but given the circumstances, we need to make sure of the identity of the body," he explained. The machine gun crew was easy to find. They were firing on a Russian train with heavily armoured locomotives front and rear, each belching out clouds of steam that seemed too dense to hang in the cold air. Bullets sparked yellow as they ricocheted without effect from the armour plating on the lead locomotive, but the unexpected impact of a shell brought the train to a screeching halt. A second shell hit a goods wagon behind the locomotive, smashing its timber walls to matchsticks. From their vantage point on a hill, the crew of an 8.8-centimetre flak cannon were having fun, tormenting the train as a cat would torment a mouse, pummeling it to scrap with shell after shell. The doors of the two passenger carriages to the rear of the train swung open. Among the figures leaping to the ground were women and children. Scheisse. It's packed with civilians, groaned the machine gunner, who instinctively stopped firing. Why the fuck didn't they get out the other side? I hissed, as shells continued to whistle down on the scattering civilians, ripping to shreds the fine line that distinguishes honour from barbarity. Nowadays, such incidents are euphemistically reported as collateral damage. The flak crew can't see them from that distance. It's a bloody massacre, snapped the machine gunner. When the firing stopped, Company Commander Krotzer arrived by car, and I helped him search the bodies scattered on the grimy tracks. I learned later that the documents we recovered showed the occupants of the carriages had been commissars and high-ranking officials, hoping to escape with their families. With my gruesome task complete, I returned to the field hospital to identify Unterscharführer Hahn's body. One of our tanks had broken through the fence and run over his head, which was now as flat as a pancake. Curiously, he was still easily recognizable with an almost comical expression on his squashed face. I straightened my uniform before stepping into Battalion Commander Fritz Witt's office. Bully, Witt's German shepherd, lay in a corner, its big brown eyes following my every movement. 4 lesser officers listened avidly as Witt pointed out a position on a map spread over a large table. Sturmbannführer, I announced with a click of my heels and a smart salute, Schütze Bartmann reporting as ordered. Wearing his Knight's Cross, the immaculately uniformed Sturmbannführer Witt turned his attention from the map. "Ah, Schütze Bartmann, let me show you something," he said with a little beckoning motion of his head. The 4 lesser officers paid little heed to my presence as I followed the Sturmbannführer to a window overlooking the 2 bridges crossing the River Don. Obersturmführer Springer's company are engaged in an attempt to form a bridgehead on the opposite bank, explained the Sturmbannführer, but as yet we have no means of communicating with them. You, Schütze Bartmann, will remedy that failing. Jawohl, Sturmbannführer, I replied. Since there is no radio contact with 3. Company, I am entrusting you with the task of laying a telephone line across the bridge. Returning to the table, he spoke to one of the officers, an Untersturmführer. Fetch a few bottles of Sekt 1 each for everyone in the room. He turned to me briefly and said, Schütze Bartmann, just bear with us a few moments. There must have been a good supply of Sekt nearby, because it didn't take long for the Untersturmführer to return, clasping 5 bottles by their necks, 3 in one hand and 2 in the other. The thought ran through my mind that the Untersturmführer had practiced this before. Not wishing to distract from the celebrations, I quietly took up a position near the corner of the room and stood at attention to await further instructions. Corks popped. Champagne glasses filled to the brim with sparkling Sekt chinked merrily. A toast celebrated the fall of Rostov, a 1,000 kilometers inside enemy territory. Fritz Witt looked over his shoulder. Schütze Bartmann, where's your bottle? Sturmbannführer, I don't have one, I replied stoically. Witt turned on the unfortunate Untersturmführer and bellowed, When I say fetch a bottle for everyone in the room, that means everyone. As the red-faced Untersturmführer scuttled out of the office, Fritz Witt waved for me to approach, whereupon he gave me his own bottle and glass. We'll just wait a moment or two for the Untersturmführer to return with an extra bottle so that we can all celebrate our success, he said. Still grinning from ear to ear, I made the connections at the station-end telephone and began to reel out the cable across the rail bridge. When I was midway across the first of the great steel latticework spans, I heard Sturmbannführer Witt shout at the top of his voice from the open window of his office, Schütze Bartmann, do not cross the bridge. Return at once. Less than an hour after drinking my glass of Sekt, I was with a machine gun crew guarding the approaches to the station when a handful of survivors from Springer's 3 Company ran over the bridge towards us. The chief of the machine gun crew grabbed the first man to make it back to our side. Where's Obersturmführer Springer? Right behind. We were trapped in the signals building, panted the rifleman, his breath instantly condensing into a white cloud around his face. Upstairs, 6 of us. Oberst Springer got us out, tossed a couple of grenades down the stairs. We're all that's left of the company. I realized then that Fritz Witt had probably saved my life. From his viewpoint in the station, he had seen the Russian attack on the signals building unfold and had called me back. Acts of bravery by officers such as Obersturmführer Springer inspired the ordinary soldier to give of his best. Springer had stayed in the signals building with a few dedicated Kameraden until the last possible moment. There was no place for the Druckerberger in the Leibstandarte, no place for officers who were shirkers that sent the men under their command into perilous situations while they mused over their military successes in the safety of some comfortable billet. Shortly after this action, Obersturmführer Springer was deservedly awarded the Knight's Cross. Like hungry swine summoned by the rattle of the stick on the swill bucket, the SS security service, the Sicherheitsdienst, arrived the day after we secured Rostov. As far as the locals were concerned, there was little to distinguish them from members of the Leibstandarte, apart from the letters SD, sewn onto a lozenge-shaped patch on their tunics. With vindictive dynamism, they quickly alienated the civilian population by plundering their livestock and searching out Jews. There was a characteristic manner in these people, a certain air, a subliminal smell that warned they were invulnerable to the natural instincts of man and unassailable by pity. In their hands, they held the power of death over life. Though we had not eaten properly for days, none of us dared barter for even a chicken with the local peasants, while the SD lurked in the background. Shortly after the arrival of the SD, I had just delivered a message to the command post of another company. I came across a Leibstandarte Schütze sitting on the steps at the entrance to a building. When I asked him why he was sitting alone in the cold, he looked up at me with yellowed eyes and with a blank expression on his face, silently shook his head. The reek of stale alcohol caught the back of my nose. I went on my way wondering why the drunkard had not already been arrested. Later that day I discovered that the SD had commandeered several men from that company to assist them in tracking down the local Jews. Perhaps the drunken soldier was one of those men, I shall never know for sure, but as far as I am aware, this is the only occasion when the SD called upon members of the Leibstandarte to help them perform their dirty work. During the last days of November 1941, the Russian winter set in with a vengeance. The fleeing Russians had cleared out the shops, and with our supply lines overstretched, food was in short supply. To keep the fuel in the trucks from freezing, the drivers shunted them back and forth until fuel became precious. Then they lit fires beneath them. By chance, a driver from another platoon told us of a food depot not far from the rail station. At full speed we drove to the storage facility, miraculously missed by the SD, to find metal canisters filled with butter and honey, tins of frozen eggs and some ham and schmaltz, a kind of lard made from the fat found around the intestines of cattle. Delicious. With our booty covering the floor of our truck, I sat uncomfortably on a canister of butter, its metal rim digging into the back of my thighs. As we tackled a steep hill on the return journey, a few of the canisters rolled from the rear of the truck and bounced off into the distance, but at least this created a little more floor space. Our overextended supply lines had left us short of supplies of all kinds, but having secured a good supply of food, our most pressing need was for ammunition. Russian troops now ran across the timber bridge to our side of the river in organized groups, without us firing more than a token shot or two to keep them on their toes. With the Sea of Azov at our backs, we were in a vulnerable position. Snow was blowing in from the east when word passed round that we were to pull back to a defensive position north of Taganrog. For the first time I sensed an air of subdued panic in the bearing of our commanders. We had no previous failures from which to learn, since retreat was a skill we had neither planned for nor contemplated. In effect, it was every man for himself and something of a shambles. In a flurry of swirling snowflakes, our Kompania-trupp piled into the back of our truck, each man finding a place amongst the barrels of food we had picked up earlier. By the time we left Rostov, we had caught up with the rearmost vehicles in the escaping column. Close to Chaltya, a town to the west of Rostov, we glimpsed a squadron of fast-moving Russian tanks in the distance. "The bastards are trying to cut us off," said Boris. our Romanian camarade, who had saved my skin with his impression of a Russian officer a few weeks earlier. "Who's in charge of the rear guard?" asked a figure sheltering behind the cabinet where our company maps were stored, just behind the driver's cab nittle, answered Boris. "If he doesn't do something—" The truck juddered as its engine coughed and died. The fresh snow creaked under the wheels as we drifted to a standstill. In abject silence, we looked at each other, none of us daring to speculate on what might happen next. The cab door slammed. A few of us shuffled to the side of the truck, straining our necks like inquisitive monkeys to watch the driver, who appeared with a heavy wrench in his hand. "The fuel must be frozen," he said, looking up at his staring audience. He bent his body like an arthritic old man and tapped the fuel tank with his wrench. "Listen to that echo," he said. "The diesel in the tank's still liquid. It's the fuel line that's frozen. Scheisse, the Russians are chasing our asses and there's no time to light a fire," someone groaned. "I have an idea," offered Boris. "Do you have a length of hose?" "Naja," said the driver, "but it's not long enough to stretch from the fuel tank to the engine." "And a funnel?" "Of course." Boris turned to us and made gathering gestures. "Gas mask canisters, water bottles, quickly, anything that will hold fuel." He passed the containers over the side to the driver. "Here, siphon fuel into them, and hurry." With Boris now at his side, the driver inserted the rubber tube into the fuel tank. He put his mouth to the tube, then spat diesel onto the snow. "My lips are frozen. I can't feel if I'm sucking or blowing." Boris grabbed the tube from the driver. "Get back behind the wheel." When he had filled the containers, Boris passed them into the cab and, rubber hose in hand, disappeared round the front of the truck. Moments later, he returned to the driver's door with one end of the tube in his gloved hand and thrust it through the open window of the cab. "I've attached the other end to the fuel line near the engine. Push the funnel into this end. I'll pour in the fuel as we drive." The door on the passenger side of the cab slammed. At last Boris was in the cab, beside the driver. We returned to our seats on the barrels of food rescued from Rostov. "I just hope the battery doesn't let us down," said a camarade. "That's tempting fate, Dummkopf," I snapped angrily. The truck swayed a little on its springs as the starter motor laboriously turned the cold engine. Our eyes, tense and unblinking, stared at each other in hope. The engine grunted and coughed agonizingly before springing into its familiar throaty snarl. Dismay turned to joy, and we cheered as we picked up speed. The inescapable apprehension one feels when death is a constant threat grinds on the nerves, strains them to breaking point. Hours of duty in bitter temperatures drives the lifeblood from the limbs. Frigid air hacks relentlessly and without mercy at the face and hands. The chronic lack of sleep saps the body's energy reserves, allowing exhaustion to set its pernicious roots into every cell of the body. In such conditions, sleep can overcome the unwary to bring blessed oblivion, or mortal danger, no matter what the circumstances. And so, too cold even to shiver, I tucked the collar of my greatcoat under my helmet to protect my face from the numbingly cold air and slipped into an irresistible slumber. I wakened with a jolt under the silence of unblinking starlight. My greatcoat was stiff, glittering with frost. I listened. Nothing moved. I was alone in the back of the truck, which stood as if abandoned, close to an isolated house. I tried to push myself from between the barrels of food, where I had slumped completely oblivious to the discomfort. Both my legs beneath the knees seemed to have turned to wood-frozen wood. I crawled between the barrels of butter and schmaltz to the rear of the truck, where I hung my useless legs over the tailgate. With a push from both hands, I launched myself from the rear of the truck, but with feet totally without feeling, I was unable to sense their impact with the ground. I lost my balance and fell forward into the snow. Using my rifle as support, I struggled to my feet and somehow managed to hobble one foot in front of the other, until, hardly caring what I would find inside, I pushed open the door of the house. Astonished faces looked up at me. There, sitting in front of a roaring fire with a handful of Russian women, were my kameraden. Stripped to the waist, they nipped lice from the armpits of their shirts, flicking them into the flames, much to the unease of their hosts who, for reasons I was never able to fathom, seemed to respect these infernal little pests. Full of apologies, they sat me in front of the fire, where I immediately fell once more into a deep sleep. The sky was already light when I wakened. My legs still had the weight of dense wood, but now the wood was on fire. I groaned in agony. One of the women pulled off my boots and socks. The skin of both legs had turned white with underlying purplish blotching. She looked at them and shook her head. A pane in the small window at the front of the house rattled in resonance with our truck's revving engine. I shuffled over to the window and rubbed a peephole in the frost fern on the glass. Before the moisture had time to refreeze, I managed to glimpse my kameraden digging snow from around the truck's wheels. Soon I would have to leave. I returned to a chair close to the still-burning fire, and ignoring the throbbing in my legs, pulled on my socks and boots. Boris called from the open door. "We remembered you this time, Irvin. We leave in a few minutes. The driver says you can sit in the cab to keep warm." When the driver, whose name I have long since forgotten, asked about my legs, I described the symptoms. "Mild frostbite," he scoffed. "That's nothing. But if your feet had turned black and fallen off, you might just have got a ticket home." He was, I thought, exaggerating though, as I later found out, not by much. "I've seen it all," he continued. "Hundreds of cases, some of them terrible. I was shocked to learn that so many of our kameraden had been victims of frostbite. We should have better winter clothing," I yelled over the engine noise. It was crazy to think the uniforms we wore back home in Berlin would be of any use in the Russian winter. "Haven't you heard the rumours?" I shook my head. "Well, the story goes that the chief quartermaster ordered winter clothing way back in September, but when he opened up the crates he found nothing but desert kit." His voice heavy with irony, he added, "Now how could that happen?" Instantly I came to the same shocking conclusion that I suspect the driver had already made, but had been unwilling to elaborate upon. The arrival of desert kit had not been some kind of incompetent mix-up at the supply depots in Germany, but an act of traitorous sabotage. Somewhere back home, high-ranking officials, secret communists, were determined to sell us out to the Russians. Onwards, we pressed until we reached the Memoirs, a river that flows into a firth that empties into the Sea of Azov. By this time, my legs throbbed agonizingly, so I reported immediately to the first aid post, set up in an unheated house, to await treatment. As I entered, a scene of horror unfolded before my eyes. A soldier wearing thick felt boots, issued to protect feet when on guard duty, screamed in agony as a doctor tried to pull them from his feet. "These boots are a curse," the doctor said. "They suck in water then freeze. It's not the first time I've had to cut them off." He looked up to the two medical orderlies standing at the end of the table near the victim's head. "You'd better hold him down." As the doctor cut at the felt boots, their owner suddenly fell silent. "He's lucky he's fainted," said the doctor. I retched as the doctor finally managed to free the first boot. The rotten flesh of the victim's leg ended in a stump of bone, leaving the rest of the foot in the boot. Feeling a little embarrassed that I had troubled the doctor with my relatively trivial frostbite, I rejoined my compagnontrop. Little did I realize the damage to my legs and feet would continue to cause serious problems more than 70 years later. Overlooking the banks of the River Meuse, we came across a small group of Wehrmacht personnel stationed in the open fields, totally without cover. Bone-chilling winds had already carved deep frowns of dejection on their sullen faces. "Start digging," said one of the older guys, an Obergefreiter who looked 50 but was probably nearer 30. He flung a spade to a teenager who stood motionless, hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat. The spade clanged as it struck a patch of stone-hard ice. Eyes streaming with tears brought on by the pitiless, icy-cold wind, the teenager looked at the spade and smirked ironically. "The ground's frozen. How can I dig? You'll change your mind when the shells start raining down on you." The teenager sullenly picked up the spade and half-heartedly prodded the ground with it. "I can't dig this," he said, flinging the spade to the side. An argument was brewing. The rest of the Wehrmacht men looked on, hoping, no doubt, that the excitement might distract their attention from the plummeting temperatures, or better, that some officer would come along to tell them a comfortable billet had been fixed up for the night. What a bunch! There were never such discipline problems in the Leibstandarte. In contrast to the Wehrmacht, most of our Kameraden were about the same age, and our leaders, although often only 10 years or so older than the men under their command, displayed excellent leadership abilities. This was a great advantage to us when things got difficult. We pulled together to overcome problems as best we could. Digging a trench was undoubtedly an onerous task in the Russian winter. Ice formed beads on our eyelashes as we dug. Our feet froze in the same boots we had used to march around Platfuss Alley the previous summer. Fresh snow filled the trenches as we dug. To add to our troubles, enormous boulders lurked under the surface, so that a promising trench, won after hacking through a layer of frozen mud, often had to be abandoned. Intoxicated by the fantasy of our ultimate victory, the Endsieg, the men of the Leibstandarte shouldered these hardships without complaint. From our position, we looked across a frozen meadow to the Russians on other side of the river, with some envy. They occupied the edge of a forest where they had prepared proper shelters to protect themselves from the penetrating cold. Fortunately, the supply lines to our new position were well established, and we had an abundance of ammunition, so we fired on Ivan from time to time, just to liven things up a little. As a respite from our miserable life in the exposed trenches, during which frostbite claimed several victims from our company, we sometimes took to the deep caves found in the area. Although they offered protection from the cutting wind, a heavy, immutable chill that gnawed at the bones haunted them. Somehow they brought to mind the frightening fairy tales told to me as a child. The Russians must have had the same idea because it was possible on occasion to hear their voices percolating through interlinking voids in the rock, a matter that made it difficult for us to relax completely.